of 2019 or so, when the
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Unpaid Interns. Austin Render here with you on Friday, September 11th. So glad you could join us today. We will have Brian Bennett joining us here shortly as we get ready to go here on a Friday episode. Brian joining us here now as we get things started. Brian, so happy to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
I think I was muted there. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Let's start off. I want to start talking about your career as a journalist, and then we'll get into some of the college basketball news going on. You've worked at a lot of different levels. You've worked with Louisville Courier-Journal, ESPN, The Athletic. Where have you seen the industry change the most since you were first with the Courier-Journal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty old, so I've seen a lot of things.
That's not what I'm saying.
But yeah, it's so different. Because when I went to the University of Kentucky, worked for the student newspaper there. I was the editor-in-chief. Always thought I would be a newspaper guy. I grew up reading the Courier-Journal. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. A lot of great writers there over the years, like Pat Forty and Rick Bozich and all kinds of great people have came through there. That's kind of what I thought my career would be, as working for a newspaper, and never really had any ambitions beyond that. It was just to go be a sports writer in a newspaper, which was at the time about the highest level you could get as a sports writer. And then obviously with the advent of the internet, blogging, writers being asked to do video and podcasts and now Zooms apparently. And it's just you've had writers have had to become so much more versatile to be able to do all sorts of different things. Still, the basic tenets haven't changed. You still have to be able to report. You still have to be able to communicate right. But just the way it's been delivered is so different. And now we're getting into, the Athletic is such an interesting project because we're a subscription only site, so it's everything's behind a paywall, and we just went over 1 million subscribers, so that's really interesting. But yeah, things have just changed so much. Newspapers aren't really a destination anymore as much as they are for a lot of people, a jumping off point to go to a national site online.
Well, you spent those 9 years with the Courier-Journal, and you mentioned that newspapers just aren't the same anymore. What, in your mind, is the future of newspapers, and how can they best adapt to stay as an integral part of the sports media landscape?
Yeah, I still think there's always going to be a market for local. The one thing that a lot of national sites can't do or are not interested in doing is really focusing hyper local, beat writers for local teams, so covering high schools. I'm just talking about sports, obviously, here, not news. There's a lot of different things there. But, I think the print product is probably going to be a thing of the past. We've seen so many newspapers already either eliminated entirely or go to a couple days a week. It's just so expensive to print a huge newspaper and then have delivery drivers drop it off. And then I think, if newspapers can kind of make that transition to online as their younger readers get older and have been used to doing that. I still think there's a place for that. There's a brand that people trust, and there's local news that you just can't get anywhere else. So they're going to have to figure out how to make money off that, though. That's the hard part. And I think where newspapers messed up originally was giving everything away for free in the early days. And now it's harder to go to people and say, hey, we want you to pay for this, even though for a lot of subscriptions, it's not very much. So they're going to have to make that transition. And I think a lot of newspapers have been very slow to do that.
Well, I think there's something to be said about starting your career on a newspaper beat, though, and getting that opportunity to try and meet deadline and be that local reporter. Would you say that's an important step for a young journalist to get that experience?
Definitely. And, my first job out of college was covering the police beat at the Lexington paper. So it wasn't even sports, but I mean, you talk about how to learn how to report is it's the most basics, your who, what, when, where, and then, reading police reports and going to crime scenes and interviewing cops and either victims or families. It's just that's the very basics of reporting. And the one concern I have about the way things have gone is I've seen a lot of young writers kind of jump straight into national publications or writing for blog sites without having kind of that reporting background. And while they're really good writers and talented, I'm not sure they have some of the reporting baseline. So the people I see who are really good have that reporting background. It doesn't always have to come from a newspaper. I mean, there are other ways you can learn how to do that. But I think that's a great starting point to really learn how to hone your beat, maybe on a smaller scale before you jump into something kind of a national audience.
Well, you've worked for The Athletic now. We've had a lot of athletic writers on the show this summer, and they talk about the flexibility that The Athletic has given them, especially in a time where we went a few months there without sports and we weren't really sure what was going to happen. Where did you kind of see that? How did you handle the lack of sports for the March to June type of scenario? And how did The Athletic kind of give you some of that freedom to write what you wanted to?
Yeah, it was it was particularly tough, I think, for our college basketball staff. I remember I was halfway to Nashville for the SEC tournament when we got the word that everything had been canceled. So I turned around and come back, and then you work all year to get to that stage. I'd actually done bracketology all year as well, and you get to the point there's no NCAA tournament, and then you're like, what do we do? And I think for the first couple of weeks we were all just kind of a little bit in shock, maybe a little depressed, and so you cover some of those stories. But then by the time you get to April, May, June, May and June are pretty slow times anyway for college basketball and sports in general. And I also cover recruiting, so I had planned on being out at a bunch of events, camps, and things like that, and none of those things happened. So that made it a real challenge. But I think the one thing we did, our founders and our editors were really great. They just said, "Hey, let's get weird." Then we actually had a Slack channel called "Let's Get Weird," and it was like, throw your ideas out there, stuff you want to write about. They had all these different kind of blitz. We called them blitzes, with like different things we did with sports on TV, sports and movies, sports and music. We did. I wrote a story about a Harlem Globetrotters cartoon from the 1970s. Also wrote some stuff about The Simpsons and their sports episodes. So it was a chance to really do some silly stuff. Try to keep people involved. And get them something different when there wasn't sports to write about. But I give the Athletic a lot of credit for hanging in there. It was really, really hard there for a while on a newer site, just trying to attract subscribers to survive that time.
Well, we talk about it here with some of our other students. Like, you just always have to have something you're working on, no matter what's going on. I mean, what's your advice when things are slow to try and get creative? Because not everyone has that creative DNA. But what's your advice on how to come up with story ideas?
I think think about things that you'd like to do if you had the time. Part of it is you never have the time, right? Almost never. Like especially during the season. I used to cover college football at ESPN, and we'd work 7 days a week from basically Labor Day to Christmas, and it was just grinding every single day. And it was just harder to do longer term projects or really, really sink your teeth into something different. So, think about those things that you'd like to write. And then when you do have either the off season or in case maybe there's another pandemic that shuts down sports, that's your opportunity to really do something different, do something weird, as we were talking about, maybe a dream project you can work on. The one advantage of the pandemic from a writer standpoint, not that there were any advantages of a pandemic, but was that we could get anybody I wanted on the phone because everybody was home. Like I could call anybody I wanted and they would answer because they had nothing to do either. So it was a good time to do stories like that and maybe even go outside of your normal range, normal beat. But always kind of have those ideas in the back of your mind. Like, this would be fun to explore if I ever had the time. And then sometimes you'll get lucky and get the time.
I agree with you. I mean, that's kind of the basis of this podcast. We were able to launch it because everyone's kind of sitting around wondering what's going to happen, especially when we started it in May. We've all been forced here, I think, the last 8 to 10 years to kind of become adapt with social media. It's something that's just become integral to our jobs. How has that changed your job as a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I remember we first got our Twitter account at ESPN.com for the Big Ten football blog we were writing, and just we had over like 1 million followers after a while. It was just crazy. But it's a place where you can break news. It's a place where you can give your observations about things, your opinions, maybe little nuggets that don't rise to the level of the story. Yeah, I think you can get lost in social media too. You can get in the bickering arguments, or you can scroll on that stuff all day long. It's also, I think, it's a great way to promote your stuff, obviously, because a lot of people will go straight to stories through Twitter instead of, they just don't scroll on their laptops or desktops anymore, or even on their phones. But if they see something interesting on Twitter, they might click through your link. But it's also a great way to, I found, to get information, and also to reach sources. A lot of times, if I need to get somebody and I'm having trouble, I can find their Twitter account. Sometimes, you can direct message them through there, or send them a tweet, or maybe you can learn some information from them, where they are. Sometimes they'll put their bio in there and you can find out, where they're located. So there's just a lot of different things with social media. I think, again, at times, I think some people spend too much time on there. Some people give away more on Twitter than they probably should. And we're working with that right now at The Athletic. We're doing our own kind of short form posts now that we hope will drive traffic there. But it's a totally different world than it was 10 years ago because of that.
Brian Bennett of The Athletic joining us here on Unpaid Interns. Let's jump into some sports topics. You mentioned the on your way to the SEC tournament when everything kind of happened. What do you remember from that weekend, the chaotic weekend that we all kind of have our where were you moment, like when the sports world stopped?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said, I was doing Bracketology and a podcast on it, so we were talking about that. I remember when the Ivy League said they weren't going to play their tournament. A lot of people were like, "Oh, that seems weird. It seems like an overreaction." But I do remember I was going to leave for the SEC tournament on a Thursday morning, and Wednesday night we were sitting around. My in-laws were in town. They just had stopped in, and we were watching. I don't remember what we were watching, but all of a sudden the Rudy Gobert news broke, and I remember turning to everybody. I was like, "Well, that's it. We're done. Like, we're not going to have an NCAA tournament. We're just done for a while. NBA is going to cancel." Like, I knew at that moment that it was over, So I remember we were all kind of scrambling and talking to our editors in the morning, like, should we still even try to go? Because I didn't think any games were going to get played, but I thought maybe there would be some reporting to be done. They're like, well, just head down there. And then they told us to turn around halfway through. So, and then it was just all out scramble to try to get some information and find out what was going on. I remember the Big East tournament, that first game, and went to halftime and they canceled. I mean, everything was really wild back then, and a little scary because I don't think people had taken COVID all that seriously up to that point. And then all of a sudden it really rocks your world, and you start to wonder, like, where are we going from here?
So when did you start becoming the bracketologist, and how difficult is that to try and field all 64, 68 teams and try and find a place for them? When did that kind of start for you?
Well, I would say it probably started when I was a kid. I would just do it on my phone all the time. I used to, even when I was like in college and beyond, try to challenge my friends to come up with like the top 16 seeds and place them all and have little challenges. It's just something I've always wanted to do. And then because I'm obsessed with the NCAA tournament, a weirdo. But I remember I had been freelancing for the Athletic for about a year or two, and I remember they called me in January, I think, of 2018. And my editor said, "Oh, how do you feel about bracketology?" And I basically told him that. I was like, "I've been doing it all my life." And he's like, "Do you want to do it for us?" I was like, "Absolutely." So I had never really, done it week to week like that, or for print. And there are a million people out there that are doing it. But it is a challenge, though. I mean, just there are so many different bracket rules that you have to follow in terms of where teams can play and their conferences and that sort of thing. And then you've got to get all the mid-majors and the automatic qualifiers and bubble teams. And, you can be, mine usually ran on Fridays during the week. And so I'd be up till 2 a.m. on Thursday, waiting for the West Coast games to finish, and trying to keep track of all that and make sure you don't have teams that played each other earlier in the season in the first round, and it's a lot to keep track of. And I had to develop a lot of different back checks to make sure. I think in the early days I probably had a few more mistakes than I would have liked. But it's a lot of fun too, though, and you really see. I think once you go through the process a lot, what the selection committee does, and you kind of understand when people say, "Oh, why would they do this?" You kind of understand why they do it because you're kind of boxed in certain things.
I think as a kid, you were probably like, yeah, it's okay. We'll just have Louisville and Kentucky play in the first round. That'll be really fun. And then you realize all the rules that come with it.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to put you on the spot here because you were the bracketologist. I'm going to let you crown a 2019-2020 champion. If you had to go back and say this team was going to win, who is Brian Bennett's 2020 champion?
We actually did a fantasy bracket, or in the days after the cancellation, where we used my last bracket and we played out all the games, fantasy in our heads and wrote about them. We had Kansas winning it all, and it's not really going out on a limb. I mean, they were number one; they would have been the number one overall seed. I think they were the best team in the country, pretty clearly by the end of the year. That doesn't always equate to a national championship. And without knowing exactly how the brackets went down, it's hard to say, but they were the safe pick, I think. I would have loved to see what Dayton could have done, though. That's the team that I was just so excited to see, because I thought that was a legitimate Final Four team. Obviously they played Kansas into overtime in Maui, so I would have loved to have seen if Dayton could have made the Final Four. What a great story that would have been. So they would have been my dark horse, not that big of a dark horse because they were number 2 seed. And then another one I really wanted to see was BYU, a team with a ton of experience, great shooting team, one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the country. Had beat Gonzaga, and I think they could have made a big run as well. So we'll never know. It's sad. I think it would have been a great tournament.
It feels like it was a great year for the mid-majors. You had Dayton and BYU. San Diego State was having their incredible run. Obviously, Gonzaga's always there, but has there been an evolution or maybe just a growth in the competitiveness of the mid-majors here over the past 5-10 years? I think kind of being maybe spearheaded by Gonzaga.
Well, as I like to say all the time, Gonzaga's not a mid-major anymore. They haven't for quite a while. They just don't operate like one at all. They're a national power. I mean, they spend a lot of money on basketball, and they're on national TV. They can get teams to come play at their place. They're number 1 seed in the tournament. So they're just maybe the unique story in college basketball over the last 50 years, or a team that's really turned themselves from nothing into a national power. But yeah, it's interesting. First of all, you got to decide what a mid-major is. Like, are teams in Atlantic 10 and Mountain West mid-majors, and they will kind of bristle at it if you describe them as such. But they fit a lot of those categories, right? I think what has happened is you've got a lot of really good teams in some of those leagues that can compete. The issue is I don't think there is as many maybe mid-majors. So we had San Diego State and Dayton last year, both top 5 teams. We would have probably been a 1 seed for Dayton and a 2 for San Diego State, which is amazing. But then you start thinking how many other mid-majors would have gotten an at-large last year? And I'm not sure anybody would have. Maybe somebody from the SoCon, but outside in the Mountain West, Atlantic 10, and the West Coast, there really weren't any at-large teams. Northern Iowa was a team that was so good, all year long, but then lost in the first round of the Missouri Valley. So it's been really, really hard, I think, for teams outside of maybe that top 7 or 8 conferences to break through if they don't win their tournament. And that, I think, has been tough for a lot of these leagues. But we've also seen a lot of teams that were mid-majors, like Butler and Wichita State, and even like a VCU and Dayton, have all kind of risen out of those mid-major ranks. So it's really interesting the way to look at it. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. Mid-major is a terrible term that doesn't really describe anything. But that's the best we have right now.
Do you see an issue with the fact that there aren't enough of them getting the at-large bids, or do you think that's just part of the process? You're putting the best teams in.
Yeah, I do think there is. I mean, I don't think there should be like 10 more teams in, but I'd love to see a few more get in. I think that's part of the real appeal and the beauty of the tournament is you have these underdogs in the tournament. And I think a lot of these teams can really play. A team like Stephen F. Austin last year probably would have had no chance to get in. because of their net ranking and RPI and all that stuff. But they did win at Duke, and the team won like 25 games. The team could really play, and they put them in a first round matchup, and they might win a game or two. And it'd be a lot of fun to see, the thing that kind of bugs me is when you see these teams in power conferences that are under 500 in their league or just been middling, and maybe they picked off a good team or two at home, in order to get those kind of quad one wins. But the mid majors just don't get those opportunities. That's the biggest thing. You just don't know if they're good enough because they don't get chances to play those teams. And when they do, it's always on the road or maybe at a neutral site. They never get them to come to their place. And so it's an unfair system from the very beginning. And then at the end, they judge it as if everything has been balanced when it never is.
This feels like a good segue into what the ACC thought was a good idea this past week. I'll leave my opinion out of it. I'll get yours. They presented the all-inclusive 2021 NCAA tournament. I know the NCAA shut it down, but what were your thoughts when this initially came out?
I mean, I think it came from a good place. I think the coaches were sincere. Part of it is probably helps for job security. You're going to get in the NCAA tournament and get your bonus. But it's going to be a crazy year. I think there's going to be a lot of conferences that play different number of games, play different types of schedules. We may see games be canceled. There may be outbreaks that cause disruptions. So at the end of the year, it's going to be really tough to decide who belongs in the NCAA tournament, especially if you don't have a lot of non-conference matchups. So from that standpoint, and from the standpoint of a lot of these kids just didn't get the experience last year, to open it up a little more this year, I think is a good thought. I just think in general, having 346 teams or whatever it is unworkable, especially in a pandemic. I think I did the math. If you have 25, just to be conservative, if you have 25 people on each team on your traveling party, that's 8,700 people. And then you start adding, officials, game officials, volunteers, media. I mean, you're talking about 10,000 people. I just don't think you can put all that in a bubble. And if you start, okay, well, you do regional, but then you have teams traveling all over the place into different sites. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't think that's workable. I also think that it just kind of cheapens the entire concept of a regular season. I mean, if you're getting in, all you're doing is playing for seeding. And there's also, probably 100 teams that have no chance of even winning a single game in the tournament. Because let's face it, there are a lot of bad teams. There's too many teams in Division I, and there are a lot of bad teams that have no shot, don't deserve to play for a national championship. So, well, I'd be all in favor of expanding the tournament a little bit this year. I think 346 is too many.
That is a lot of teams, and I think you're right. I think it cheapens not only the regular season but the tournament itself. Everybody getting into it. College football tried to return, and they are currently trying to return. And some are struggling, some are canceling, like the Big Ten, and some are still going forward. What can college basketball learn from the attempted restart here of football?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is just to see the health situation. How does this work? I mean, what are the situations with outbreaks on campus? We've already seen huge outbreaks on campus just for regular students. We've seen several programs have to shut down for a couple of weeks because of outbreaks on the team. And now you're going to have, some travel involved. You're going to have full contact sport out there with people, even some people in the stands at a lot of places, even though they'll be socially distanced. So I mean, this is a giant experiment, right? It's a lab here for college basketball to watch. And there's a lot of differences in the sports. College basketball just has a lot fewer players. Obviously they're in close contact and there is contact, but it's not quite like football where you're tackling each other and jumping on each other and getting in these big piles. So yeah, I think that the health is really going to determine how it goes. If it goes fairly well for the teams that are playing, I think college basketball would be in a spot to maybe start play around Thanksgiving and feel pretty confident that they could get that done. If it goes really poorly, then I think people will be a little skittish, especially college administrators, and you may see it pushed back to January.
You used to be a college football or a Big Ten football writer. What do you think of what's going on in the Big Ten right now? I mean, it just feels like a really tough spot for Kevin Warren and just a chaotic mess from someone who's living in the middle of it here at Indiana. It just feels like we can't get any answers.
Yeah, what a time to be a first year commissioner, right? I would love to see what would happen if Jim Delaney were still commissioner, because
Ooh.
the one thing you can say a lot of good and bad about what he did, but people
Mhm.
followed what he said. And Kevin Warren comes in. It's just a different situation. He hadn't been involved in college sports for a while, and I just think the communication has been very poor. I don't disagree with the decision not to play. I think it's the safe one. Maybe it's too cautious, but I understand it completely. I mean, you can make an argument for either way, but it certainly seems like it's the safe way to go. But I think everything was just so botched about it. They put the schedule out, and then a few days later, they canceled the season, and there wasn't a whole lot of explanation given as to why. There wasn't a lot of public comments coming out of the Big Ten office. Teams didn't seem like the schools didn't seem like they were understanding the vote, even though there was a vote. And so now you've got coaches coming out and speaking out against the league and threatening to play on their own. I mean, it's a mess, and it's crazy too, because the Big Ten, in my time covering them, was always a league that seemed pretty tight. They seemed pretty well together. They always talked about collegiality and all this stuff, but and now it just seems like everybody's kind of on their own little island, and it's been completely botched, I think, especially when you look at the Pac-12, which made the same decision, and there's been no real pushback or rift in that league.
I think I saw this on Twitter. All they had to do on August 10th or 11th, whenever it was that they canceled, say, look, we need daily testing, and until we get that, we won't play. So I think that's what the Pac-12 did, and it's been better. Just really a strange situation. Something they can't do in football, but maybe could do in basketball is bubbles. What do you see in terms of an NCAA tournament bubble, conference bubbles? How could they use that to try and get this season in?
Yeah, and there's already a bunch of there's some event companies and different schools that are already setting up their own potential bubbles and just waiting for word from the NCAA to have some events on their campus. And in a non-conference, if you could use that time between Thanksgiving and New Year's when kids aren't on campus, that's a way maybe you could set up a bubble, even use in the dorms and that sort of thing. Conferences could maybe, I mean, athletic, we had a whole plan for an entire bubble for the entire country. The different conferences could maybe pick a weekend or two, maybe go to a neutral site. If you're the Pac-12, maybe you go to Las Vegas. And then NCAA tournament, I think, could be done. I don't know if it could be done with 68 teams, but maybe in later rounds or something. The problem is going to be, I think, the cost of it. It's the NBA spent a ton of money on building its bubble for 30 teams. College basketball got 346 teams, as we talked about, 68 in the tournament. So they don't. I don't think they have the kind of money to, make sure it's a really safe bubble and a penetrable one, kind of as the NBA is. So I don't know how that's all going to work, especially for a lot of these athletic departments are really cash strapped now because of COVID, because of the football situation. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they do that, what kind of testing is available. I don't envy people in these decision-making processes. And then you've got the idea of students being potentially bubbled off campus, student athletes. And it's like some of these schools have in-person classes. So there's so many different decisions, and so many different colleges are doing different things. I don't know how it's all going to work. I'm glad I don't have to have to decide it.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Do you see? I mean, there's some people out there making the argument, look, these guys are amateurs. If you're not going to treat them like professionals, then don't bubble them like the professionals. Do you see an argument there? Do you think this could work because November to February, a lot of people are going online, and it could be just that they're not missing class?
Yeah, it depends how you do it. I mean, there are a lot of universities that are mostly online. So if you're a basketball player at a college where you're taking all online classes anyway, it's not that big a deal, I think, to be bubbled. I think a lot of these teams, especially at big time programs, in that holiday break, they're pretty much already bubbled anyway, right? They have to stay there. They don't get to go home for Christmas, or if they do, maybe it's a day or two, and they're in their dorms and they're practicing twice a day. So, I mean, it's really not that much different for them. I mean, that time of year. It's more, and then even in the NCAA tournament, we see this all the time. Kids are on the road for 3 weeks. They have tutors go with them. They have study halls in their hotel ballrooms. So the idea that they're acting like real students at that time is pretty ludicrous. So there's some precedent for that. It can be done. It's just a matter of timing. Where we're at with the virus. The testing, I think, is going to be huge. And I think the advantage college basketball has is time, is being the last sport to go. I mean, hopefully by November, December, January, testing has greatly improved. We've seen a lot of, progress on that front already. Who knows if we'll get a vaccine or some sort of better treatment by then. So there's just so many questions that I understand why it's so hard to decide. But we'll see what happens. No one has any answers at this point.
I agree with you. I do not envy the position of some of those commissioners. Before I let you go, let's ask a non-COVID question here. Assuming the season does go and you get some basketball this winter, what are some of the storylines non-COVID that you are tracking going into the 2020-2021 season?
Well, that's a great question because I barely given it a lot of thought on the next season. It's more last several months is always like, are we going to have a season? When's it going to start? What's it going to look like? But I think last year, I thought it was a little, I think everybody kind of agreed it's a little bit of a down year for college basketball. The talent level wasn't great. And there wasn't a great freshman class that came in. And even some of the best players either didn't play much or went to teams that didn't make the NCAA tournament. This year, I think there's a really solid class coming in freshman wise. Even though Cade Cunningham is the best player, he's not going to play in the NCAA tournament anyway because he went to Oklahoma State, which got on probation. But I think we're going to see some really good teams. I think Villanova could be loaded. Baylor, pretty much everybody back after a great team last year. Gonzaga will be really good. So I think there's going to be some really, really good teams at the top. I think the level of play will be a little bit better. And then, trying to watch some of these teams that were heartbroken last year, like how they rebound. What does a Dayton or San Diego State do this year, without the same teams? So I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting stuff that happens. It's probably all going to be overshadowed by the format the season takes place, however.
Yeah, it just feels like everything you have to ask with that caveat of, well, if it happens or if COVID goes away and whatnot. I did want to ask, because we are a podcast centered in Bloomington, what are your thoughts of the way Indiana basketball has gone the past couple of years under Archie Miller? And did you see anything last year that made you start to think that might be going in the right direction?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they had a weird year. I've had a couple of weird years, but I think they were pretty solidly in the NCAA tournament. And that's a good step. It wasn't a great team. That I don't think they were going to make the Sweet 16 or anything like that, but I think they would have gotten in. And then you build on that, and it's just about getting players there. It hasn't really happened for them. They had Romeo Langford, which was just okay when he was there, and he obviously wasn't healthy. So different things have happened there. It's always been weird to me why they can't get this program really rolling, but a lot of things have happened with the coaching situations. But it's a sleeping giant there. Obviously, it's not going to take that much. Just get a few players and get that thing rolling. I think Archie Miller, he bought himself some time last year, and I do think that a lot of schools are going to be very reticent to make coaching changes now in this pandemic and with all the budget cuts and restraints and everything. So he'll get a little bit more time. It's just a matter of getting some players in there and getting this thing rolling.
Well, it gives us plenty to write about. It keeps us on our toes with who knows what's going to happen every season. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you coming on and giving us half an hour of your time. Good insight on who knows what might happen, but some good insight from you on what's going to happen for the basketball season. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe. Best of luck to you.
Same to you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Take care.
Dude.
That was Brian Bennett of The Athletic joining us here on Unpaid Interns. Really glad that we could get him on the show. Some good insight into a season that we just don't really have any idea what it's going to look like. It might be a somewhat normal season if there's a treatment and a vaccine by January. It could be a really crazy season if we start getting these non-conference bubbles, conference bubbles, NCAA tournament bubbles. We don't know, but Brian gave some really good insight into not only his career as a journalist, which was awesome at the first part of it, if you didn't catch that. First 10, 15 minutes, we talked about his journalism career and then dove into college basketball. Some really good stuff from Brian Bennett of The Athletic. Really thankful for him to come on. He did join us right away, so we didn't get into any headlines. I'll end the show with some of them. First, obviously, important that we do acknowledge the tragedy 19 years ago that we will never forget here on September 11th. Obviously, want to acknowledge our thoughts to all those who continue to be affected by that day. Obviously, we'll never forget the tragedy that happened and the victims of just a senseless, awful attack. So I just wanted to make sure that we got our heartfelt condolences out there to everyone who still continues to grieve or deal with the pain from 19 years ago. Sports wise, last night the NFL returned. Deshaun Watson outdueled by Patrick Mahomes big time, and the Chiefs look better than ever with Edwards-Helaire in the backfield for the Chiefs. And I will say this, I was thinking about this last night, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and this is a very talk showy type of take here. But I've thought this because I've been a Colts fan and I've watched him because he's in our division. I think Deshaun Watson is good, not great. I just think that when people try to hype this matchup up as Patrick Mahomes against Deshaun Watson, if that's the matchup, then there's no competition. I mean, Mahomes is going to win that matchup every time. They're on completely different levels as quarterbacks. I think there's at least 5 quarterbacks I would take before Deshaun Watson if I wanted to start my team. Mahomes, Jackson, Wilson, Rodgers, and I even think Prescott. I think I'd take Dak Prescott over Deshaun Watson. And then there's the quarterbacks like Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Big Ben that I would take if it were 5 years earlier. But they're just so late in their careers, I don't know if I'd take them over Deshaun. I just think Deshaun is a good quarterback. To me, he's like a Matt Ryan or a Phillip Rivers. He's going to get you wins and get you into the playoffs. Now, take Matt Ryan's past couple of years out of it. But he's going to get you the wins. He's going to get you into the playoffs. He might not get you very far in the playoffs, kind of like Phillip Rivers. But he's going to get you 10, 11 wins and make you look like a pretty good team. And he's kind of like Phillip Rivers, where he's never had an excellent offensive line. And you wonder what he could be if. But Houston never gives him that. So I don't know. That was just kind of my takeaway from last night, watching them really struggle offensively. He seemed a little off. The team seemed a little off. And I think we're going to see that week 1. No preseason. We've talked about it with a couple of the NFL writers. Zach Kiefer pointed it out. If there's no preseason, things are going to be sloppy early on. And I think we saw that last night from both teams, but especially from the Texans, who I think take a step back this year. And I just wanted to put that out there. I don't want it to be like I think Deshaun Watson stinks. I think he's a very good quarterback. He's not the great quarterback that I think he gets thrown into. He's no Russell Wilson. He's no Patrick Mahomes. He's no Aaron Rodgers. I think he's a Phillip Rivers or a Matt Ryan. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about it there with Brian. Ryan Day put out a statement, head coach of the Ohio State Buckeyes, criticizing the Big Ten and also hinting at an October start. But meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, Rutgers president says, no, that's not going to happen. He says that Trump has been using cheap politics to try and influence the Big Ten. It does not sound like Rutgers. It's the first time we've heard a president really come out and make a statement, which kudos to Rutgers. But it does not sound like they are on board with any sort of immediate restart of the football season. Finally, before we go, a fun note yesterday was the sports equinox. First time ever. Here's the list of all the sports that occurred yesterday. NFL, NBA, WNBA, MLB, NHL, MLS, both PGA Tour and LPGA Tour, college football, and tennis. That's 10 different sports happened yesterday. And it's the biggest argument you can make for the NFL. It was the sports equinox, and maybe it's because it was the first day of the NFL, because if it's Houston, Jacksonville on Thursday Night Football, we're probably not as engaged in it. But it just felt like, yeah, there's 10 sports going on, but oh my gosh, 90% of the people are watching the NFL. It just felt like there were very little eyes on LeBron and the Lakers, very little eyes on whatever. I think Miami played last night in college football. The MLB felt secondary. The NHL has felt secondary. I feel like the NHL kind of gets ripped off with some of its coverage, and even the U.S. Open tennis, it just felt like everything was focused on the NFL last night. And I think it's the best argument you can make that the NFL just reigns supreme. It just point to the sports equinox when there were literally 10 sports on. And I bet you at least 75-80% of the people watching sports were tuned into that game. I watched it basically from start to finish. Love to see football back. Cannot wait for Sunday. Really excited to get that NFL season underway. And it was really good to see that last night. Huge thank you to Brian Bennett for joining us. Huge thank you to Brody Miller as well, back on Wednesday, our 2-episode week because of Labor Day on Monday. We'll be back to our 3-episode rotation next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Monday's episode will be a special 2:30 start time. So our guest, which I will keep unnamed until Monday just to make sure we don't have any last-minute snafus, but he will be joining us at 2:30. He's a West Coast guest, so we're trying not to make him get up at 7 a.m. to join the show. So 2:30 in the afternoon on Monday will be our show, and then we will be back to normal, I believe, on Wednesday and Friday, normal 10 a.m. start times. Remember, you don't have to catch us live. It's always great to see the numbers and see some people watching us live on our YouTube page. But if you don't catch us live, and you're listening to this probably recorded, so you know this anyway, but you can watch us anytime on the IU Sports Media YouTube page, or you can listen to our podcast on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcast under Unpaid Interns. Honestly, if you're listening to me at this point, 6-7 minutes after Brian left, I'm very impressed. But we do appreciate our listeners. We appreciate everybody who's made this podcast work here for the past 4 months, and we appreciate the guests as we continue to fish and put some hooks out for some guests, and they continue to be extremely gracious with their time. And Brian Bennett, just another one of those. So a huge thank you to Brian for coming on the show today. Got to wrap things up for our Friday episode. For Brian Bennett, I'm Austin Render saying so long. For today's episode of Unpaid Interns, have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday.